Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the rise of Kamala, the fall of Biden, and Sean O'Brien's speech at the RNC convention. I'm joined by my co-editor and co-founder Sohrab Ahmari, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. At the turn of the century, in the German city of Nuremberg, a young man named August Engelhardt proclaimed a new creed. In his book, The New Evangelism, glimpse into the depth and distance for the selection of mankind, for the reflection of all, Engelhardt taught that people should eat only coconuts, because coconuts are the same shape as the human head. He declared himself the first apostle of the coconut palm, and said his faith would breed big, noble, health-holistic humans. In 1902, Engelhardt acted on his philosophy by moving to Capricorn, a small palm-covered island in the South Seas. There he established his Order of the Sun Equatorial Settlers Association, built himself a wooden hut, and bathed in the sun. When he wasn't eating coconuts, he wrote about them. They were for him his philosopher's stone. In time, he drew followers to his island, including Anna Schwab, the first female member of his Order of the Sun. But his nascent coconut empire failed. In 1919, the temple fell, his followers were dispersed, and the coconut empire did not rise then in the South Seas. But the coconut empire, Sohrab, has risen today in the United States of America with the ascent to the Democratic ticket of Kamala Harris. Are you coconut pilled, as they say on Twitter? Are you with Kamala?
I am not, as you might have guessed and probably knew. I mean, there's all the funny stuff you can talk about, like just her vapid sort of pop philosophy stuff that she offers at any given news conference in which she's clearly underprepared. But the bigger issue for me is, and it's one that is shared by some people in the kind of left spheres with which Compact's circle overlaps, and that is that she represents a kind of full regression back to the Clinton-Obama model of aggressive cultural progressivism blended with kind of neoliberal technocracy, which, from my point of view, I dare say from our point of view, is sort of the worst combination. In order to accept why that might be seen as a degeneration, you have to accept my premise, which Matthew may not necessarily share, but that Bidenism represented in some ways a concession to the populist uprising that erupted across the developed world, not just in the United States, in the mid-aughts, and much of it driven by anger over the effects of free trade, especially with China, on working class jobs and communities, and related phenomena like monopoly power and so on. So you can look at certain things like the CHIPS Act, which tries to bring back semiconductor production to the homeland, or the sorts of stuff that Lena Khan, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, has been doing on antitrust, and some other elements of Bidenism that are genuinely populist or trying. There are signs that Kamala is not into that stuff. I mean, she is pretty embedded in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. Lots of Silicon Valley people are opening their wallets to her, and these people want stuff. For one thing, they all want Lena Khan out of her job, and yeah, I think it'd be unfortunate if Kamala caves into them as president. In terms of choices of people for her running mate as the presumptive nominee, I don't see many like real Democratic populists like let's say Sherrod Brown being a contender. So, put that all together, it's that combination is pretty bad. That sort of Wall Street, Bay Area, plus cultural progressivism plus Obamian technocracy. I hope that's not true because she might become president, and I want the country to not go back in that direction, but seems likely or probable.
Well, so you're not gonna drink the coconut juice. I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical too of the rise of Kamala. One thing that's notable is that Democrats have held the presidency for 12 of the last 16 years. We had two terms from Obama, one from Biden, one from Trump. During that period, the Democrats, supported and presided over, or actually pushed at the introduction of things ranging from gay marriage to the Affordable Care Act, measures that were, if not universally approved, uh, certainly backed by broad popular support. And I think a lot of those popular agenda items have been exhausted for the Democrats. Biden has very low approval ratings. It's just not that clear how much more there is on the agenda that's really popular. Democrats are floating certain ideas, forgiving all medical debts. Well, these are bold ideas that certainly excite a portion of the electorate. Uh, they're very unpopular with other elements of it and are certain to encounter intense resistance. So I'm just not that sure how many more levers there are for the Democrats to pull. I mean, Harris doesn't really seem to have any ideas, to have any firm political identity, and that reflects her own flip flopping on issues. As we discussed in our last podcast, going from being smart on crime prosecutor to position herself as a more of a criminal justice crusader during BLM. But it does go beyond Kamala, and I think it's unfair to pin it solely on her. It's also just harder at this point in time to really offer the country something as a Democrat that the country is going as a whole is going to embrace. I think that's part of why Biden ran on things like defending democracy and a return to normalcy. As you say, Sohrab, he did have an agenda. He helped to ratify really and entrench elements of the Trump turn when it comes to things like tariff and a new stance toward China. But it's been hard uh, in this kind of these Biden Harris years for the Democrats to offer a distinct policy agenda that they can actually push forward.
By the way, in that regard, we have a piece by the great Justin Vassallo, headline. By the time you hear this, that piece will be out. It's under editing right now, but the headline is "When Liberals Fought Free Trade," and it's talking about a period in the 1970s when liberals, in attempting to both kind of shore up the New Deal order, but also harkening back to what he describes as their sort of Jacksonian tradition, had pretty drastic both prophecies in terms of what free trade would do to American jobs and manufacturing, and solutions for it. And he goes through this history of bills in the 1970s that attempted to, assert political control over free trade. And those people have now been vindicated 50, 60 years later. And it's I mean, in a way, the piece by Vassallo is also a vindication of Biden's populist elements, which have come under attack not just from the kind of conventional right that's hostile to industrial policy, but lots of different sectors of the left who see opposition to free trade as basically racism. I mean, that's his upshot, is that how is it that among certain kinds of progressives, being concerned about free trade's effects came to be just synonymous with backward, bigoted ideologies, given the fact that this sort of thinking used to be at the heart of the Democratic Party's mission in the world. So anyway, check that out when it's out at compactmag.com. The headline is or will be "When Liberals Fought Free Trade."
Yes, Rob, I just want to go into this a little more because you've raised an important question about the Biden administration's actual policy record, on which a more populist right type person might be able to find some points of agreement, and then its messaging. One of the most interesting points here came in May when Biden's U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, issued a statement. In a press conference, she was asked about tariffs and whether they cause inflation, and she said, and I quote, "First of all, I think that link in terms of tariffs or prices has been largely debunked." She said from a White House podium. This immediately caused alarm on the part of the Biden campaign because the Biden campaign had been aggressively campaigning against Trump on the basis of his proposed tariffs. And they were warning, and this was a talking point that was echoed across the entire legacy media, that Trump's trade policies, his tariffs, were going to raise inflation. Then you had a Biden administration official speaking at a White House podium saying, no, tariffs don't per se cause inflation. Tai was forced to walk those comments back, and the political scandal, such as it was, ended. What was left, though, was the strange irony of the Biden administration ratifying certain tariff policies while also trying to present Trump as extremely dangerous and irresponsible for supporting the same policies as the Biden administration. And I think the Biden administration has really failed to square that circle, and it's just one of the really odd elements of their economic messaging.
Yeah, I think this point we've made is even on the stuff that they do well, they won't message it the right way. Like they won't just own it as tariffs. They won't just own it as, populism. Um, and it's because they're answerable to this kind of NGO blob slash, Atlantic magazine that, to talk about certain things in a certain way, especially with respect to trade or globalization, is to be in league with really bad people, a really bad half of the country, let's be honest. And it's tragic. I mean, it's tragic for them from an electoral point of view, because, those elements of the Biden agenda that are in continuity with the Trump agenda are not getting highlighted that way among the voters whom they need the most, which are these kind of Obama to Trump voters, former Democrats who have defected. They don't hear it that way. What they get are, coverage on MSNBC of books like White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy, that, these preposterous books that frame large swaths of the country as irredeemable, bigoted, stupid, people who are not willing to make the adjustments needed to get the kinds of jobs of the future that they should get, and instead stew in their resentments against foreigners and minorities. And I think that's how the Biden administration codes for a lot of people. I was talking to a senior figure on the Hill, a Democrat on the Hill, obviously off the record or on background, and he was like, well, what would we have done differently to reach people like that? And one thing I pointed out, and this is unrelated to trade issues, but you remember, Matthew, the farm aid that was unveiled by the Biden administration in the wake of the pandemic to help farmers who had been hurt by the pandemic. It was based on racial preferences. If you were a farmer belonging to certain, historically marginalized groups, you got priority in this sort of assistance. And if you're in the farming kind of community, you see that, you immediately say, these people hate me. They hate my family. They're not with me. Like, why do that? Why not just do, class-based, old school, Rooseveltian general help to people instead of this kind of race-coded farm aid? It's they just shoot themselves in the foot.
So much has happened since we last recorded. Biden pulled out of the race. Maybe just saying a word about that. For my part, just very struck by, in the run-up to that, seeing these videos of Biden, moving with his arms seemingly locked in place, which is something that if you've ever lived with someone who has Parkinson's, you would recognize. I'm not a medical authority. I'm not making a diagnosis, but things like that, his great rigidity, difficulty getting into an SUV. He kind of seemed to have come to resemble one of these Tarim mummies, these desiccated figures found in the uh, deserts of Xinjiang province, China. Just this, absolutely dried out and rigid figure. Uh, and I guess he's finally bowed to reality. Uh, Hunter tried to make a stand, but Biden's pulled out, huh?
Something was off about this. I'm not saying that, like, looked at his watch and his statement last night, and it was not the same time as it was being broadcast live. Did they really kill Biden and record this? You know, I'm
What
not
kind of
talking.
journalist are you?
It's like, I'm not talking about stuff like that, but you know, they kind of did push him into his Delaware beach house and put enormous pressure on him when he was determined to go on. Um, Look, political parties are not the same. I mean, and they're not democratic in the same way that a democratic polity is supposed to be. They've always been this kind of mix of popular elements and elite backroom power. But if they had been willing to acknowledge Biden's health issues, mental capacity issues much earlier, I think the whole process would have gone maybe more smoothly. I don't know, but as it is, it just looks like a series of the media working double time until a month ago to say that Biden's just fine, and anyone who complains about it is a conspiracy theorist or using manipulated videos to undermine him or what have you. And then suddenly, over a course of a month, suddenly, everyone getting on a different song sheet and saying, no, no, he has to pull out, regardless of the fact that he did win a primary process fair and square. It all just seems off. I don't know, but in a way that I can't pinpoint. I'm not suggesting a conspiracy. To be clear, there's no conspiracy alleged here, but it's a little weird. It's all a little weird.
It seemed that Biden did want to stay in the race. One way of assessing whether or not he had the strength to conduct a presidential campaign was just to see whether or not he could withstand the pressure that was being placed on him by the rest of the party. He folded, he failed that test. Obviously, if you can't stand up to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, you don't have what it takes to win a presidential race or to uh, deal with America's adversaries abroad. So he lost. He's out. I do think the dynamic you identify with people just switching uh, their tunes just overnight has become really obvious in recent months and is going to lead to a further decline in trust of media. We've seen all of these news broadcasts and legacy media publications saying the right is lying when it claims that Kamala Harris was a border czar. Axios was one of many outlets that in the last week published this claim, and people on Twitter pointed out that Axios itself had originally promulgated the claim that Kamala was Biden's border czar. So there is this thing where journalists decide that they can have a rapid inversion of reality. Suddenly up becomes down, and it's very, very discrediting. It's not true by any mean of all journalists or all institutions, and I think the ones that resist that and are more sober and responsible do stand to gain uh, legitimacy and trust in the months ahead. Forget Kamala, forget Biden, all this stuff. Let's talk about someone really important, Sean O'Brien. Your friend Sean O'Brien, or at least your interview subject, Sohrab, on Monday, we published your interview with Teamsters President Sean O'Brien under the title Sean O'Brien's Brave Gambit. What did you learn in speaking to him just a week after he addressed the RNC?
Yep, this was his first interview since that RNC address, so we're very proud to have that at Compact. Of course, it speaks to our project of trying to make workers' rights and collective bargaining and all that part of a political center, as opposed to something that's associated with the left. And what I took away from it is that he's just completely unflappable, unbowed by the barrage of criticism he's getting from um, the kind of labor left, the Brooklyn type, labor notes, labor left types who, are calling him a fascist and worse for what did he do? He gave a 17-minute speech at the Republican National Convention, and he spent most of that time just highlighting the way in which corporate America has robbed working people of their bargaining power and of their systematically how they've systematically suppressed wages. That's it. So he gave a right wing audience a tour of what the economy looks like from the point of view of the labor movement, something they're not used to getting. And why did he do this? The thing that he wanted me to emphasize, which is why I kind of put it in two ways, in two different quotes in the piece, is just the simple fact of the political views of his rank and file. He said, I have 1.3 million members. They're Democrats, some of them. Some of them are Republicans. Some of them are independents. And I cannot just pretend to represent a third of those workers who are Democrats. I have to try to represent the full spectrum of my members' views. And this is true of lots of other national unions too. UAW, I bet, you look at other ones, especially, of course, in the trades, hence the Teamsters, but in other sectors as well. And those other mainstream labor leaders, unfortunately, don't represent the full spectrum of views of their members and have become adjuncts to the Democratic Party. And he made a very good point that, you know, Democrats, it's true that a lot of Republicans who are now starting to make pro-worker noises haven't really shown that in practice. But that's also true of lots of Democrats who make pro labor noises. They get the donations, they win the political office, and then the labor movement gets crumbs. So his approach instead is to be open to working with both parties and then to be equally tough with both parties. That there's going to be accountability. We will support you if you support our issues, and we don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. And that position is so eminently logical to me, at least, that the opposition he's getting just makes zero sense to me. And what's funny about it is that he's like, well, those people, he calls them the far left. Those people are welcome to stay on the sidelines, but I'm in the game. I'm in the arena. I'm making deals. I'm getting stuff out of Republicans like J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley. So, basically go hang it, he tells them. And I have to, this is not in the piece, but it's worth talking about on the podcast. I have to note of this one thing. You have Sean O'Brien, a guy who's, a grandson and a son of Teamsters from Medford, Mass, was a truck driver in Boston, went to only a single semester of college before joining the Teamsters, before rising to become president. And all of his members, and many of whom are open to working with, a Trump-Vance administration, even if they don't plan to vote for it, they're open to working with them. You have those people, and then the people who constantly call the Teamsters fascists now. And I'm sorry, but you look at their bios on Twitter, and it's always like Professor Autoethnography at Columbia U, trans flag, Palestine flag, hammer and sickle. There is a distinction between these two groups in the what's called the labor movement, and you can't deny it. And look, I think, as I think people who are professors or knowledge workers, they are workers, and they deserve representation, they deserve collective bargaining, they deserve decent wages, they deserve good health care. That's not an issue. But what's a problem is the imperious way they try to set the agenda for other working class people, especially people who toil with their hands, basically, and insult them, call them fascists and racist for doing something that's very logical. And I loved Sean O'Brien's attitude. He's like, okay, you stay on the sideline commenting on Twitter or in your, Brooklyn book club. I'm going to do the real stuff. It's very reassuring to hear him say that.
I'm a little unsettled by that, Sohrab, by what you said, and I want to push back. I mean, how can you say that an unmarried 39-year-old man, living in Brooklyn with support from his parents, who took 8 years to complete his Harvard dissertation on the history of labor movements. How can you say that he doesn't know more than Sean O'Brien about how labor should conduct its business? When you consider the time investment, just the scholarship, the learning, the expertise he's acquired, uh, this is someone who has studied with eminent labor historians, has absorbed the literature, and is just very aware of the intersectional nature of social movements. I think O'Brien should just show a little more deference to guys like that.
Yeah,
Sarcasm.
no, I
Please.
know you're right. Look, I commit to work on myself. I know I've fallen short. I'm gonna do the work. I'm sorry.
Well, look, we better get off this podcast because who knows how else the world will fall apart. Uh, Before we go, I want to recommend to our listeners an old but very good compact article, Raw Egg Nationalists, One Weird Trick by Christine Baumgarthuber. There she discusses the coconut empire, and I cribbed from her excellent article discussing the coconut energy of Kamala. If you don't know, that just refers to a quote of hers where she's talking about coconut trees that became a bit of a meme online. That's why people say coconut pilled when they mean supporting Kamala. And with that, thanks, Rob. Thanks, listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe.